The Parasite Eve series is one that usually people have some fleeting memory of, and others have never heard of it at all. The series' debut was during the late 90s, where survival horror as a genre was kicking off into high gear after the success of the hugely popular Resident Evil by Capcom for the PlayStation in 1996. For those like myself who never owned a Resident Evil game, the taste of survival horror could only come from others in the genre, like Alone in the Dark and Parasite Eve. The first in the series, and the game which we will be covering today, was released in March 1998. The game itself is actually a sequel to the novel of the same name, written by Hideaki Sena, who also had a role in writing the game along with Takashi Tokita, the lead designer of Final Fantasy IV, as well as the director for this game. Like most Square games of its time, the scores on Parasite Eve are fantastic, which is a trend that continues into the later games. The first in the series was composed by beloved Yoko Shimomura of Legend of Mana and Kingdom Hearts 2 fame. The game itself is not actually a survival horror. It's branded as an ARPG, but almost in every other sense this game wants to be a survival horror. The game's successor, Parasite Eve 2, is a game branded as an ARP survival horror game, and in a sense Parasite Eve can be seen as survival horror light before its ARPG shackles would be freed by Parasite Eve 2 and would embrace more and more survival horror elements. Our story begins in New York, Christmas Eve 1997, on a snow-dusted night. Outside an opera house pulls up a sleek limousine. Sliding off the seat and into our story is Aya Brea, a 25-year-old NYPD officer. Arriving with a date identified creatively as
Man,
there is a distinct impression that she does not really want to be here, despite that she seems to have been the one to choose the opera in the first place. They make it just in time as the first act begins.
Why is he burning?
After the carnage, and seemingly being the only one alive, Aya makes for the actress, who is levitating around the stage. Rather anticlimactically telling the levitating woman to
freeze.
The woman explains in vague terms that she should be
Awakening soon.
and that her cells are.
Crawling out?
After a somewhat lukewarm battle, Aya complains of her body getting feverish, along with a shimmer of glowing particles around her. Incensed, the actress explains that
Their bodies are communicating.
the more Aya uses,
That power.
the more she will become like the actress. With all the vague exposition, Aya demands to know who this actress is. The actress replies simply, Eve, and seems surprised that Aya has no memory of her, explaining that she should know of her well. A flashback briefly ensues, with what looks like an operating room, or a ward of a hospital, where sits a young girl in one of the beds. Aya, seemingly confused as to what this was, demands to know. Eve only laughs and floats away, with Aya in tow. Arriving at the massive gaping hole in the roof, Aya hears the sound of cop cars, of backup behind her, but decides to jump down after the actress anyway, backup or not. Reaching the bottom, there is a visage of a little girl, one that has a similar resemblance to the girl in the flashback, and Aya seems to have an unspoken revelation as to the girl's identity. Rounding the corner, the girl is gone, and Aya ends up backstage amongst the dressing rooms. In the corridor lies our first real encounter. After killing the rat, amongst the rooms of various items and people, Clown is still in his dressing room, somehow not incinerated to death, who scrams off. And in another room are horribly burned corpses, one of them still alive, who explains that Melissa, the main actress, is a monster, and that she probably got Suzanne, whoever that is, too. In the furthest away room on the right, under a body, Aya finds a key, the theatre key. In another room in this corridor is the apparent diary of Melissa, the main actress, and seemingly a perpetrator of tonight's carnage. Diary reveals that the actress Melissa is desperate to get the main part in the Christmas play, as the lead will have a solo concert in Central Park, and that she has, quote, taken all the medication to get here. The next entry shows that Melissa and another actress, Suzanne, are double cast, with Melissa lamenting that she had wanted to play the part alone, but that she knew Suzanne was a talented actress. The next entry complains of overdoing it and of her body getting a feverish pitch, promoting her to take more of this unknown medication. She then talks about collapsing and seems now reserved to her fate, saying,
I don't care if I die, I just want to get through this show.
This continues over the next few entries, with Melissa worrying about her ailing health and how it will affect her, compared with the talented Suzanne, saying she would take even more medication that night. The final few entries are more chilling. We find out Suzanne was burned in an apartment fire, and now Melissa will be getting what she wanted, finishing with, God forgive me. The last entries go over the play's opening night on the 23rd, which she says went smoothly, and that the next day, Christmas Eve, will have the biggest crowd of the season, with more talk of medication in order to get through the solo concert in Central Park. At the end of the diary, Aya finds another key, the rehearse key, allowing her to confront Melissa through the door at the end of the corridor. We find Melissa playing on a piano somberly, her own self seemingly in a desperate and losing tug of war with the being known as Eve, fretting over her being warm. In the midst of this, Eve takes full control, and that her, quote, nucleic domination had come to an end. All of a sudden, what was once Melissa, now Eve, begins to change. Eve gives off some more exposition, and another flashback of the same hospital and the same girl, along with a mysterious doctor who enters, and Aya seems to have another out-of-the-blue recognition. Afterwards, with Eve plunging downward again. God, she just can't get enough of punching holes in the floor, this woman. Aya follows, ending up in an amazingly well-lit sewer tunnel, where she yet again comes across the same girl she had seen from earlier, who leads Aya down the corridor to confront Eve once and for all. Catching the monstrosity at a dead end, Aya yet again complains of a feverish temperature, and Eve rather rightly mocks her for her naivety for coming down here alone, then admitting that if she did have anyone with her, they would have just burned like the rest. With more demanding from Aya, Eve explains that she's going to give Aya some time to think, to evolve, leading us into a cutscene and the first true boss battle of the game, the alligator. After the fight, we pick up outside Carnegie Hall, where we get the introduction of Aya's pseudo-senior mentor partner in the force, Daniel. A big well-meaning brash and blunt man, with a family life in somewhat disrepair. Aya emerges from the hall and is swamped by pretty much the video game day equivalent of today's media, asking to get an exclusive interview with the sole survivor of the ordeal. Daniel rolls up and knocks the presenter on his arse.
Better hope they weren't recording that.
The following car scene is rather uneventful, with Daniel serving as catch-up, and Aya wrapping up Eve's exposition about cells and mitochondria. But we find out that Aya's date survived, so that's something. This leads us into the final cutscene of day one. Day 2 begins as Aya arrives at the office, restless, understandable considering the events of Carnegie Hall, who gives Nix and Warner, colleagues of hers, the rundown on the previous events, basically amounting to affirmations of,
"I'm with her.
and
We need a bigger gun."
we then visit Baker, the atypical hard-ass police chief, who gives her a permit to indeed get
Bigger gun.
Around the station we meet several recurring characters, the first being Wayne, as Aya goes down to the armoury to cash in her permit. Wayne works as Torres's begrudging lackey, filled with a boyish confidence that is often wiped off his face when Torres is around. The guy who runs the armoury, a gun expert who apparently hates guns. Next we meet a boy who we find out is Ben, Daniel's son to his estranged ex-wife. Apparently Ben, Daniel and his ex-wife were going to attend the solo concert in Central Park. Daniel tries to explain that he's busy with police work, but the kid storms off. After amusing around, we go back to Baker's office, where he explains that there's going to be a press conference right now, and that he wants Aya there, and that only he was to do the talking. Baker tries to pin the carnage on a terrorist, and to be quite honest, you can hardly blame him. I mean, the sheer panic he would cause if he mentioned any of the details from Aya's report. Oh. Back in Baker's office after the debacle of a conference, during a scolding from Baker, he gets a phone call from a Japanese scientist, for some reason trying to contact the chief of police in broken English, raving about mitochondria. Nick's conveniently read about a new researcher at the museum who recently wrote a new theory on mitochondria. Baker sends Aya and Daniel off to the museum, hoping that it might explain the strange phone call. Another car scene is thrust upon us on the way to the museum.
The doctor's name is Clamp.
And apparently his research covers
the whole genetic spectrum,
along with Aya giving Daniel crap for kissing the chief's arse. Daniel explaining that he wants to keep his job. She doesn't have to, of course, because she is the main character after all. After the back and forth, we meet Dr. Clamp, and the antisocial description of the man seems right on the money. After first thinking he's being accused by the NYPD, Aya seems to have another flashback as she looks into the man's eyes and realises that this man seems very familiar, but she neglects to admit this at the time. Briefly catching the doctor up to speed, Clamp grabs his arrogant spectacles and whips them on with pride. The mitochondria possesses its own genetic code, which put him onto the theory that the mitochondria is a separate life form entirely, with Daniel offering kinda like a parasite. Thanks, Daniel. Like a parasite, Clamp explains that we cannot live without the mitochondria, and that without the mitochondria creating energy for us, we are nothing, and that we are only here because the mitochondria allow us to be here. Essentially, Clamp's idea is that the mitochondria have been evolving since the beginning of creation, 10 times faster than our own rate, and so in his mind the mitochondria have come to control us, consciously, and that the events of recent would be child's play if all the mitochondria began functioning at the same time. He also relays the story of a scientist who tried to determine the mutation rate of the mitochondria. With it, he wanted to establish a connection with human ancestry, and that a discovery in 1987 that the root of all humans can be traced to a single woman in Africa. With the discovery, the mitochondrial theory spread like wildfire. And do you know what they call the root of it all? Mitochondria Eve. With such a revelation, Aya pipes up about the woman calling herself Eve at the opera house, and the doctor suddenly turns silent and keeps his mouth shut, somewhat stunned by the news that the culprit was identifying herself by the same name, but for what reason we don't quite yet know, with Aya and Daniel leaving on that bitter note. During the ride back to the station, Daniel suddenly gets a buzz over the radio. Apparently, there was a break in the case and they have to get back to the station as soon as possible. We arrive back in time for a briefing from Baker. He explains that Melissa disappeared after last night's events and that the concert has been cancelled, but for some reason people are still gathering on the stage. When Baker explains that it's going to be at the amphitheatre, Daniel realises that Ben and his ex-wife Lorraine are at the same concert and rushes out to go and find them. Baker instructs Aya to watch his back. Aya and Daniel arrive outside Central Park, Daniel not wasting a second, nearly charging into the park without a thought toward the events of last night, nearly being incinerated in the process. Due to the nature of the situation, Aya is the only one with the ability to enter the park and endure the heat, promising Daniel to get Ben back. In a room next to a phone is another burnt corpse, and in the drawer is the zoo key. At the animal enclosures, we see that all the animals have escaped. Aya battles through the zoo, making her way toward the amphitheatre, where she finds Eve on the stage talking to herself, who is wrapped up in the fact that today was the day when she would finally no longer be under the control of a host, and that the mitochondria must take over the nucleus. It seems now that Dr. Clamp may not have been so crazy after all, and with that, Eve begins her performance. After the occupants are melted in their seats, Aya makes to confront Eve backstage. Aya demands to know why she is doing this, and Eve only explains that she's too late, and that there is no chance of foiling her plans tonight. She scrams off, with Aya chasing behind her. Outside the amphitheatre, we see the same visage of the girl, who leads Aya once again through the park, leading her onto the right path to confront Eve. She finds the monstrosity at the end of an underpass, next to a horse-drawn carriage. Eve compliments Aya's strong genes and offers Aya a ride, for which some reason she accepts. The back and forth during this battle is essentially Eve, angry at Aya taking the human side, although it's not clear to say at this moment whether Eve is talking to Aya or her mitochondria. Eve explains that it was Aya's mitochondria that drew her to the opera that night. Eve then asks to join forces, the usual
"If we combine, we can never be defeated"
spiel, then finishing with, "Then let me explain." Directly. After the flashback, we pick back up with Daniel outside the park when Ben suddenly stumbles upon him. Ben rather tragically explains that all he wanted was to go to the concert with his mother and father, but now sadly, his mother was melted with the others at the amphitheatre. Apparently, Ben had felt sick as he got near the stage, when his mother Lorraine began acting strange, and Daniel is left with the realisation the mother of his child is dead, and that Aya is still somewhere in the park. We pick back up in Baker's office as he's giving a debrief to Nixon Warner, affirming that he cannot put the citizens of New York in any more jeopardy. and is ordering an evacuation for Christmas. Nix, in a moment of clarity, says that such a thing should be left to the army, but Baker argues that the police are supposed to be protecting the people and not the army, apparently. In the midst of this, Daniel bursts through the door, wanting to know if anyone has heard from Aya. With nothing, he drops Ben off at the station's kennel and sets out to find his friend. A foreign man approaches a police blockade down a long street, identified as
Japanese man.
He tries to explain that he has already spoken to the police chief about his entry being allowed, but is limited by his English. Conveniently, one of the guards just so happens to speak Japanese, and after a diverse cultural exchange, one of the guards complains of his temperature and suddenly combusts. Now identified by the game as Maeda, seeing his chance, he slips past the barricade. The other guards apparently too stunned to do anything. We return within a flashback, passing images of what looks like a hospital. Aya awakens to the sound of a fire in some strange dilapidated room. Maeda, sitting across from her, introduces himself. Daniel enters, and we get some heavy exposition. Turns out Maeda was the one who found Eve after the carriage crash. Daniel explains that New York is now a ghost town, and Aya receives the news that Ben was safe. Maeda seems surprised at the news that the audience melted and that, quote, nothing like that ever happened in Japan. So hang on, Maeda phoned Baker in that phony accent, despite the fact he seemingly can speak perfectly fine English. Apparently a similar incident happened in Japan 7 years ago. He says it all began when the wife of a scientist was badly hurt in a car accident. The scientist tried to culture her liver cells in order to keep her alive. The scientist named those cells Eve. According to Maeda, the liver cells multiplied and her mitochondria began taking over her physical body. After somehow acquiring the scientist's sperm, Eve tried to give birth to something called
The ultimate being.
Before the accident, the wife had registered to have her organs donated, and that after the accident, her kidneys were transplanted into a young girl. Turns out in a rather sick turn, that Eve somehow implanted a fertilised egg in the young girl, who succeeded in giving birth to the ultimate being. With all the plot dropping, it still doesn't explain why Aya is the only one unaffected, and all the evidence points, in her eyes at least, to being a monster like Eve. Frightened of what she could perhaps do, she demands Maeda and Daniel leave, and they do so. Now alone, and time to think,